23 in just a little bit, that's a wilderness pasture right there. Not the sort of pasture land that you might think of, in a Texas dairy or cattle raising setting. Certainly not the pasture land I think of on my Midwestern grandparents' farm. But you've got these sporadic outbursts of grass that are very inconsistent. You can have a slope with nothing, right? And north-facing slopes tend to hold their water a little bit better. West-facing slopes tend to get more moisture. East-facing, southern-facing slopes tend to dry out very quickly. And so you can be looking at a lot of this and never find this unless you know where you're going here. And that was the job of the shepherds in the interior, right? The Bethlehem shepherds, like David, would take their livestock out into the wilderness when the grain was growing in the village farm fields. So the village farm fields were off limits to shepherds during the agricultural season. When the agricultural season came to an end in May, they were welcomed in. They would leave behind their manure, re-enhance the soil. But once the seed was planted and sprouted, they're done, right? It reminds me of a couple of years ago, I had to start a big chunk of my lawn. And we hardly ever see deer in my neighborhood. And I would get up in the morning with these wonderful little sprouts coming up, and there were deer tracks everywhere from the night before. And I'd get up early in the morning, and there was like 6, 7 deer in the yard. They just love those early sprouts. You don't want those in your farm fields, right? So the livestock gets kicked out, and where do they go? Where you get these little flourishes of green in the wilderness. And those are going to be the wilderness pastures. It's a place you go to get away from everyone else. We see monasteries developing in these canyons. We could wander through here and find some early monasteries that were part of the ascetic life of Christians who just wanted to come out here and be alone. We may well visit Qumran. They're using the wilderness in the same way, seeking some sort of isolation from others. But the place that I turn to best understand the function of wilderness in wilderness stories and communication is Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 through 3. In Deuteronomy 8, Deuteronomy 8, 2 and 3, Moses is working to explain why it is that the Lord took Israel out of Egypt and then into an extended multi-decade stay in the wilderness. Part of that was self-imposed, but part of it was divinely directed. I need you out in the wilderness for a time. And given the importance of Israel in Promised Land, it begs for an explanation. Make sense? Why would you take these people whose destiny and whose mission is to bring about redemption of the world in one space? Why would you keep them out of that space? So Moses explains it here. Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble. That's number one, to humble. And you spend some time out in this space where you don't have the fundamentals for survival, and wow, that kind of brings you right back down to the limitations that I face as a human being. When I look at topographic and geologic structures that are older than I am and that will be around longer than I am, and they're much more massive than I am sort of repositioned and humbled by what I see around me. And those are people in whom faith grows. So one of the reasons of putting Israel in wilderness to humble you and to test you in order to know what's in your heart. Now, God already knows what's in our heart, but we don't always know. And so wilderness functions as a way of saying, let me demonstrate for you what I know, but you don't necessarily know, and that's what you're capable of. A wilderness is a place for that demonstration. God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order that you to know what was in your heart. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known. Here's number 3, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Wheat fields are wonderful. Wheat fields are wonderful, but what's even better is a promise from God that he'll supply your needs. And he says, I want to teach you that I'm capable and willing and able to do that. And the wilderness is where I can demonstrate, where you can't, I can. And so those three things in Deuteronomy 8 always stand out for me as I think of any element of wilderness communication or story or poetry. God brings people into wilderness in order to humble, to test, to show that what they're capable of, and to teach that he is willing, capable, and able to sustain people through difficult times. Now that brings me to Matthew 4.